Praise the Lord. During the previous period, we have completed the analysis of the Old Testament. We have analyzed the books from Genesis to Malachi, the 39 books of Old Testament. Now, before we enter into the New Testament, we have to take some time to consider the intertestament period, or the silent 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. There's a gap of 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. What actually happened during this period is very important. So before we enter into the analysis of the New Testament, let us analyze the period between Malachi and Matthew, known as the intertestament period or the silent years. Now this period covers about 400 years. To be very precise, exactly 397 years. Or Old Testament history closes with Malachi in 397 BC. Now let us analyze the background history and the condition of the Jews during the time of the close of the history of Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. Kindly recall the history of the condition of the Jews at the beginning of this 400 years. Now Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the people were carried to Babylon as captives. That was in 587 BC. Then the Assyrians destroyed Israel, that is the northern kingdom, in 722 BC. That is 135 years earlier than the destruction of Jerusalem. Now Babylon was overthrown by the Medo-Persian Empire, and we come to Cyrus, the king of Persia, who issued the order for the Jews to return to Jerusalem and build the temple of the Lord. Now under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a remnant returned and they reconstructed the temple of the Lord, and it took 21 years for them to complete the reconstruction or the rebuilding of the temple, and that was completed and dedicated in 515 BC. Now thereafter, Ezra took a small group of people to Jerusalem, and he restored, under the leadership of Ezra, the worship was restored in the temple of the Lord. And 12 years later, Nehemiah came to Jerusalem and he rebuilt the broken walls of Jerusalem. Now these things we have studied in the books of, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, While we were analyzing these books, I told you that Old Testament history closes there. And then we have analyzed the books of prophecy. Now the prophets lived during the historic period. Books are separate, but period is the same. Now, after the reconstruction of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem and the reinstating of the worship in the temple of the Lord, what happened is what we are going to examine. Now with this, the Jewish remnant was back in Jerusalem and in Judah. Now they rebuilt the temple, the city walls, and the worship was restored. Now note the term remnant. I was telling a number of times the term remnant. Now it tells us that the great mass of Jews did not return, but they remained in the land of their captivity. The whole Israelites were, deported, and they were taken as captives, and only a remnant, a small group of people came back. The great mass or the most of the Jews did not come back, but they remained in the land of their captivity. Now it is in the remnant that we see Jewish history restored, or we are going to analyze the history of the remnant that returned to Jerusalem and Judah, and not about the Jews who were dispersed all over the world and in the land of captivity. Now Jewish history was restored and preserved between Malachi and Matthew, or the Old Testament and the New Testament, only in the remnant. So we are focusing on the remnant that returned to Jerusalem and Judah. Now a lot of political and religious changes came up over the Jews during this period. This was a long period, 400 years. So many political changes and religious changes came up. Now we have to examine the political and religious changes to understand the details that are presented in the New Testament. For example, once the New Testament begins, we see the Roman rule. And once the Old Testament closes, we see the Persian rule. So how the rule from Persian empire turned and came to the Roman Empire is worth analysis. So first of all, let us analyze the political background or the political history, and then we will go into an analysis of the religious changes that came up. During the New Testament period, we see synagogues, we see the Sanhedrin, we see Sadducees, we see the scribes, but we don't see any of them in the Old Testament, So a lot of changes came in the New Testament or during the time gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they can be broadly divided into political changes and religious changes, which need to be observed for the analysis of the New Testament. Now, to begin with, we will look into the political background and learn the political changes that came up. Now, during the 400 years of Jewish history between Malachi and Matthew, we are focusing on the remnant, you should not forget. Now, that period politically can be divided into 6 periods. They are the period of Persian rule between 538 and 332 BC, then the period of Greek rule between 333 and 322 BC, then followed by the period of Egyptian rule 323 to 203 BC, then the Syrian rule between 204 and 164 BC, then the Maccabean period 165 to 63, and the Roman period 63 to the time of Jesus Christ. So 6 periods: Persian rule or the Persian period, the Greek period, the Egyptian period, the Syrian period, the Maccabean period, and the Roman period. We have to take all of them one by one and examine the very necessary details. Now, to begin with, the period of Persian rule can be seen in Ezra, Ezra chapter 1, 1 to 5. Kindly read that. I'll read the 5th verse. All the people whose spirit God had raised went up to build the house of the Lord, which was in Jerusalem. So Ezra refers to a group of people returning from the Babylonian Persian captivity to go to Jerusalem and to build the temple there and to build the walls, etc., which can be traced out from Ezra. And that is during the Persian period. Now, the 6th period about which I have mentioned is the Roman period. And as we enter into the New Testament, we see the Roman period. And if you read from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 2 and 1 and 3 and 1, we can see the change. Luke 2 and 1 reads like this: And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. So Caesar Augustus means it is a Roman period. So once the Old Testament closes, it is the Persian period, and once the New Testament begins, it is the Roman period. And in between, we can see 6 rules coming one after the other. Luke chapter 3, 1 and 2 reads like this: Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judah, and Herod being the tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and of the region of Trachonitis, and Lucinius, the tetrarch of Abilene, Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest, the word of the Lord came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Now, you may not be familiar with all these names, but we can remember Roman Caesar, Tiberius, and then Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judah, appointed by the Roman government, then Herod, the tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, the tetrarch of Iturea, places like that. And then high priests also participating in the political and religious social activities. So this occurred during the Roman period. So New Testament begins with the Roman period and Old Testament closes with the Persian period. Now what actually happened politically during the 400 years between these 2 testaments can be explained in the following way. I hope you have heard the 6 periods led by the Persians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Maccabeans, and the Romans. Now the very necessary details about each of them, let's take one by one. the period of Persian rule from 538 to 332 BC. During the first 60 years of the intertestament period, Palestine was under the Persian rule, which continued till the time of Alexander the Great. All of you must be familiar with Alexander the Great and his Greek Empire. Now the Persian Empire extended from Greece in the west to India in the east. The capital of the Persian Empire was Susa or Persepolis. Now we can read about that in the historical books like, Nehemiah, Esther, etc. Susa in Persepolis. Some of the kings of the Persian Empire resided at Babylon, and important Persian kings named in the Bible and otherwise are the following. Cyrus was the one who conquered Babylon and made Persia a world power. He is the one who permitted the Jews to return to Judah and Jerusalem for the building of the temple. Then he was followed by Artaxerxes, mentioned in Ezra. He was another Persian king. Then Darius I, who permitted the completion of the temple of God, was the third Persian king. Then Xerxes was the fourth king, who was followed by Artaxerxes I, who permitted Nehemiah to complete the construction of the wall of Jerusalem. And they were followed by Artaxerxes II, Darius II, Xerxes II, and Darius III, who was defeated by Alexander the Great. So 9 kings ruled over the Persian Empire, and during their period that the remnant returned and they reconstructed the walls, reconstructed the temple, the worship was reinstated, etc. But the most important development of this period in Jewish history, which we have to take note of, is the emergence of a group of people called Samaritans to prominence. The rival worship established by the Samaritans became established at this particular time. Now the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrian Emperor repopulated or repeopled the scattered cities of Israel. Do you remember that all the people of Israel were taken as captives to Babylon and Assyria? Then the place where the Jews lived in Palestine was empty, So that area was repopulated by Assyrian rulers, and a group of mixed people known as the Samaritans. Samaritans doesn't mean people of Samaria, but a mixed group of people coming from different areas were brought and stationed in the evacuated places of geographical areas of Israel or Palestine. And if you have read the book of Nehemiah properly, we can see that Nehemiah faced opposition on his way to Jerusalem. While Nehemiah was coming to build the walls, he was opposed by this mixed population on the way. Kindly read Nehemiah chapter 2 and 10, chapter 4, 1 to 3, 13 and 3, etc. Now, for the saving of time, chapter 4 and 2 refers to the army of Samaria. The army of Samaria. It is the army of Samaria that resisted the coming of Nehemiah to Jerusalem to build the walls. And chapter 13 and 3 refers to a mixed multitude. A mixed multitude. Now this mixed multitude was separated by Nehemiah. If you remember the history, it was separated and the non-Jews were thrown out, etc. And what we have to bear in mind is this. As we enter into the New Testament, we see a rivalry between the Samaritans and the Jews. A rivalry existing between the Samaritans and the Jews. Now that continued to the New Testament times and they started during the Intertestament period. If you are familiar with John's Gospel chapter 4, where Jesus encounters a woman of Samaria who came to draw water. We read in John chapter 4 and 9, the Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. The Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. Why? Because of the different developments that came up during the Persian period. The simplest thing that you have to remember is that the Samaritans were a mixed people brought by the Assyrians in the state of Palestine. It was given to them and they dominated there. And you heard about Sanballat, Tobiah, etc. All these people came from the Samaritan group, and they opposed the real Jews. So the rivalry between the Jews and Samaritans started during the Persian period. That is what spiritually, for understanding the New Testament, we have to bear in mind. Now from the Persian rule, the second rule that came up was the Greek rule. Let's examine the Greek rule, which started in 333 BC and extended up to 322 BC. Now this happened under the leadership of Alexander the Great, who was a world conqueror. Now the Greeks defeated and replaced the Persians, and Greek rule was established by Alexander the Great. Now they were the first Western power to control the world. Till this time, the world was controlled by either Asia or Africa. Asia means the Persians and Africa means the Ethiopians. Now it is for the first time that a Western power comes forward to control the world under the leadership of Alexander the Great. Now Alexander overran or defeated Egypt, Assyria, Babylon and Persia, and he conquered the whole world. Even Palestine came under his control. And Alexander was very considerate to the Jews. He spared Jerusalem and permitted the Jews to settle in Alexandria. He established Greek cities all over his dominions. Greek culture and language spread over the world during this period, and that is one of the reasons why New Testament was written in the Greek language. Greek language and Greek culture spread in Palestine and over the world, and that is why the Old Testament is written in Hebrew language, whereas the New Testament is written in the Greek language, because of the influence of the Greek rule over Palestine. Now, on the death of Alexander, his empire fell to 4 of his generals. 2 eastern sections of his empire, that is Egypt and Syria, fell to Ptolemy and Seleucus respectively. Egypt was taken by Ptolemy and Syria was taken by Seleucus. Now Palestine bordering Egypt and Syria went under the control of Egypt at first and then under Syria. So the Egyptian rule and the Syrian rule came over Palestine because Palestine bordered both Egypt and Syria, and the followers of the generals of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies and Seleucuses, ruled over Palestine. Now let's look into the Egyptian rule, which extended from 323 to 203 BC. The longest of the 6 periods of the Intertestament period was the time of Egyptian rule, as we consider the history of the remnant. Now, as mentioned earlier, with the defeat of Alexander, Judah fell into the hands of the Ptolemaic rulers, and 7 Ptolemies ruled over Judah. 7 Ptolemies, Ptolemy 1 to Ptolemy 7. 7 of them ruled. There is no need to go into the details of the activities of all the Ptolemies. What is relevant that we have to remember in understanding the New Testament is this: it was a peaceful and happy time for the Jews, because the Egyptians did not persecute the Jews, and the Jews were permitted to build synagogues in all their settlements, and Alexandria became an intellectual center of the Jews. The most important achievement of this period is the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. Probably you heard about that. The Septuagint translation, that is the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew language to Greek language. I hope you remember that during the Greek period, Greek language and Greek culture spread all over Palestine, and it was necessary for the people to get a Greek Old Testament. So the Old Testament from Hebrew language was translated into the Greek language for the first time, known as the Septuagint translation. Bible scholars very often refer to the Septuagint translation, and Septuagint means 70. Septuagint means 70. So 70 noted Hebrew scholars did this great work of translation. Gradually, Palestine became the battleground between Egypt and Syria, and that led to the establishment of the Syrian rule over Palestine. So Egyptian rule came to an end. I hope you remember all these developments. Now during the Greek period or during the Persian period, the coming up of Samaritans, and during the Greek period, during the time of Greeks, the spreading of Greek language and culture, and during the Egyptian period, the coming up of the Septuagint translation. These are the very important things that we have to note. And during the Syrian period, which extended from 204 to 164 BC, it was a tragic period in the history of the Jews, and the most tragic part of the Intertestament period for the Jews, the Syrian rule. Now, with the accession of Antiochus Epiphanes to power, a reign of terror fell on the Jews. And if you examine the history of the Syrians, 9 rulers ruled over Palestine, with Syria as the center: Seleucus Nicator, Antiochus, and Antiochus I, II, Seleucus II, III, Antiochus III, etc. 9 of them ruled, and all of them persecuted the Jews. And it was a time of a reign of terror for the Jews. And what did actually they do? They wrecked Jerusalem. They tore down the city walls. They killed many people. And the kings, Antiochus Epiphanes, was determined to exterminate Judaism. He defiled the temple in every possible way, like prohibiting temple worship, prohibiting circumcision, enslaving Jews, offering even a pig on the altar of sacrifice, which was not permitted by God, and erecting statues of false gods, especially the statue of Jupiter in the temple. He destroyed all the copies of the scripture that could be found, and he tortured and killed people who had copies of scripture with them. Now, these activities led to a revolt from the side of the Jews, which is known as the Maccabean revolt. And as we reach the 5th period of Jewish history, that is the Maccabean period, we see the Jews retaliating against the Syrian rule and establishing their independence. Now we will examine the rest of the periods, that is the Maccabean and the Roman periods, in the coming classes. I hope we have followed the most important points politically, or changes that came up politically in the Intertestament period during the time of the first 4 political rulers. And we will close here for the day, and we'll continue this analysis in another class. May God bless you.